I have a question, one here, about the ethical implications of the fact that Bonhoeffer was involved in a conspiracy, at least at the edges. I want to put my finger on that and come back to that. That's a question that people are typically wrestling with when they interact with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Before I go there, let me say a little bit more to try and hone in what I was talking about first with you all. And I'll do that by referencing Glenn, again, my mentor, the reason why I became interested in Dietrich Bonhoeffer to begin with. He trained a number of Bonhoeffer scholars. For Glenn, Bonhoeffer was a mentor. Bonhoeffer had what Glenn described as a thicker Jesus, and I was just talking about this over lunch. Glenn said that, this is Glenn Stasson, my mentor, he passed away in 2014, the person who trained me in Christian ethics. He said that in the United States, Christianity is suffering from a problem that began at the origins of the country. That was when Jesus was thinned down to fit into the cracks of harmful ideology and make slavery a Christian practice. It becomes theological justification for harmful stuff. Instead, what we need is what he described as a thicker Jesus. One that stands on its own, cannot slip into the cracks of harmful ideology. One that makes demands of us. And Bonhoeffer had that. So historically, look back at people who have exegeted the way of Jesus. See, because thickly, because if Jesus can slip into the cracks of your harmful ideologies because the social commands have been severed, becomes primarily ideology, principle, argument, and so forth. The Sermon on the Mount, for example, the largest block of teaching from Jesus in the Gospels, are high ideals, things that we can't do. They simply show our inability to follow the way of Jesus. We don't get anything for our Christian moral lives from what Jesus says. Bonhoeffer did, on the other hand. Thank you. Bonhoeffer did. That's what the book Cost of Discipleship. That's its English title. The new edition just simply calls it by its German title, Discipleship, not Phobia. Discipleship is engagement with the Sermon on the Mount, which is to say engagement, robust engagement with the way of Jesus. Bonhoeffer gets this. Glenn is mentored by Bonhoeffer and goes a little bit further, a little bit beyond Bonhoeffer. I will push my dear mentor as well. This is what I'm doing here with you today. And the point that I would make with Glenn is this. If your thicker Jesus is white, you've got a thick white Jesus, which remains a problem. It may be, as Reverend Brown said, we were talking over lunch, that the problem in the United States is not only that we have a thin Jesus, we have a very thick white Jesus who makes demands of us, who sets in that space of ideals for ideal human being and ideal community, arranging white space around the ideal person who populates those. This is important for a couple of reasons. This thick white Jesus also shapes the way we understand what it means to be Christian. It's the form of a lot of our Christianity and our theology. I say this to point out the fact that over the centuries, that interaction with Africa was happening in a very problematic and harmful way. And interaction with Jews and Muslims in Europe, people were also writing theology. Those centuries of the slave trade also included formation of theology, which is why it's not a good idea to look at the theologian in distinction from their context. Because they're writing this, if they can write it without interaction with those kinds of things, it says something too. So I push him on that. Which is the main point that I was wanting to make. The other one I would say is this. About Bonhoeffer again. I had the opportunity, while I was on sabbatical, to visit the concentration camp where he was killed, Flossenburg. These concentration camps were set in these remote spaces. Visited both Flossenburg and Buchenwald, and had the opportunity presented itself. I would have gone to other concentration camps as well. But there was this fascinating thing. You're driving through beautiful scenery. If you've had the opportunity to go to one, you know what I'm talking about. Beautiful scenery. Flossenburg is in Bavaria, it's a beautiful farm region. Then up crops this awful thing. Death camps are like that. Flossenburg was not a death camp, Buchenwald not a death camp, these are work camps. They worked them to death. But there at Flossenburg, thinking through, how did this person end up here? He's Aryan. Society was being built for his well-being, specifically for his well-being. Yet he died in a concentration camp, like one of the people who were being pushed out of the ideal community that was being set up for his well-being. How did this happen? This is one of the things that people are intrigued about with Bonhoeffer. How did this happen? There are lots of others who died in death camp, in concentration camps as well, who were Germans pushing back against the Nazis. We happen to know about him because he wrote a lot. And he was a high-profile pastor, politically active against the Nazis. Well, by taking a look at him in that way, Bonhoeffer can become a hero for us that people have used over time to imagine their Christianity as representation of their Christianity. He becomes an avatar that people embody for lots of different struggles. That can be a little problematic. It's important to pay attention to his context and while looking at what he was writing. Bonhoeffer is not your avatar. People do the same thing with Martin Luther King Jr. They do the same thing with Jesus. We do this with historical figures who are safely not present to correct you. But while he did die as one of those who fought against the Nazis, he also did not have it figured out. He didn't. We inhabit a time, right now, where the gospel is co-opted for harmful practices. It has been for a long time, for a very long time. And it also is represented by figures who we find ourselves being following. We hold in high regard. Bonhoeffer is one of those kinds of people who intentionally pushed back against the harmful rhetoric of his day, while also wrestling with himself. Because this ideology that we understand as race and othering, harmful othering of people, is so deeply ingrained in our society and our very being. It is so deeply ingrained. We inhabit our space here on earth for a short amount of time, yet we come into a discourse on ideology, on difference and identity that is centuries old. Everything in society tells you something about yourself, whether or not you are that ideal person or not. Whether you are that ideal person or not. Everything in society will tell you that. As this ideal figure. Nobody is accidentally anti-racist. You have to be intentionally engaging it. It's not going to happen by accident. And that intentional pushback to it may cost you, which is what ended up happening with him, even though he was still not figured out, not solved, hadn't solved it. And when I say that, I risk saying that because it could mean, well, he didn't get it out. So I guess I'm okay. But he also died for that pushback that he gave to it, working against it intentionally until the very end of his life, at 39. So let me just stop my initial remarks with those. Well, with one more caveat. One more caveat. I talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer as the capstone of the work that I did when I was a doctoral student, and the book comes out of that research. I also talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Those figures and those Christians are formative for how I understand myself. It's important to know that while Bonhoeffer is somebody who was placed in high regard, there were plenty of people who were saying this content well before Bonhoeffer, who remain important, saying the very thing that I'm saying about Jesus, not as a white person, not as this ideal figure. Their voices are as important. And I'll just say that. Now, if I may take a moment to talk about this question. That Bonhoeffer was involved in an assassination attempt, a coup attempt. We know about this primarily as an assassination attempt. And a friend wrote a book with some of his students. The title of the book is Bonhoeffer the Assassin, ? Nobody has claimed that Bonhoeffer was an assassin. He was in prison. Nobody's ever said that Bonhoeffer was an assassin. No, Bonhoeffer was not an assassin. He was not part of an assassination attempt. I mean, he was in prison. The Operation Valkyrie happened July 20th, 1944. Bonhoeffer was already in prison, at Tegel military prison. But he was a part of a group that was planning a new government, a replacement government. By this time, the Nazis had amassed so much power and influence that resistance movements were futile. The time to do something was back in the 30s, when Bonhoeffer was speaking out, when Hitler needed Christian support and got the Christian support. In Wuppertal, the place where the church is, where the Barmen Declaration was signed. Barmen Declaration signed by a group of pastors who actually, Karl Barth says he wrote it while the Lutherans slept. Wrote it himself while overnight. And it's a declaration of what the confessing church is. The confessing church is a movement of pastors who, confessing meaning more like a mission statement or doctrine. These are the ones that are saying, we are the actual confessing Christians. The rest of the Christians in what make up the German Christian movement are false Christians. They're going along with Hitler. And that was the majority of Christians in Germany. But the confessing church movement, they wanted a separation between the government and the Protestant German church. While the German Christians wanted a synchronicity between the church and the government, tying them together under the Führer principle, making Hitler the leader of the government and the church. The confessing church Christians wanted a separation. As they understood it, the church is God's right hand, the government is God's left, and the two do not mix. But there were lots of confessing church Christians who had no problem with Hitler. They didn't have a problem with the Nazis. They wanted this separation. That was their argument. Bonhoeffer was much more radical than that. It's not the mix between the church and the government that's the primary problem. That is a problem. But it's Nazi race hatred. And we cannot let that go. That is a problem for Christians. He called it a status confessionis for the church. It is a defining problem for us. We cannot turn a blind eye to this. But they did not listen to him. At that time when it was building its power, had the Christians listened, had they been able to recognize those issues as Christian issues, there were enough Christians in Germany to have made a difference, but they didn't see it. That was a problem. So by the time 1944 comes around, and the Nazis have all of the power they need, and Hitler had no need anymore to proclaim himself as Christian, to describe himself as Christian. Christians are trying to figure out, or at least the resistance movements are trying to figure out what to do. And there were a lot of resistance movements. They were clandestine. Circles would form with people who knew each other very well. And you can't just join a circle and become a member. They get infiltrated by Nazis in that way. Some of them did. All of the resistance group died when they were infiltrated. Bonhoeffer's group around the Abwehr, which was a kind of a German version of CIA, planned a new government. It was not simply an assassination. It was a new government. But the struggle that he faced was this. You have full knowledge that people are being murdered. Lots of people are being murdered. You know that for a fact. You've got knowledge of that. What do you do? To do nothing is to be guilty. To act is to be guilty. Because at this time it's not simply a resistance movement. To act means to replace the government. To replace the government, you can't just, as one of his, as a relative, as a sister-in-law, tells a story in a documentary about speaking out publicly against the Nazis. She said, just a statement. It wasn't a bunch of things, it was just a statement while she was out public once. She comes home, she's married to Bonhoeffer's brother, to Dietrich's brother. And she tells him what she did, and she says, don't ever do that foolish thing again. Don't ever do that. Americans don't really recognize what it would be like to live under a totalitarian regime. You think that you go out and do a resistance or something like that, and that makes a difference and lets people know. But when you're in a totalitarian regime, as she's describing it, you cut the tail or you poke the tail and the head will bite you of the snake. You have to cut off the head. The totalitarian regime works very differently than something that we're familiar with. So, to act, then, is to become guilty. In his book, posthumously published, called Ethics, Bonhoeffer says, throw himself on the mercy of God to act and accept the guilt. It was people perceive him to be throwing out his pacifism at that time, because Bonhoeffer was a pacifist. He said this: peace and justice were things that were worth giving his life for. People believe him to have thrown that out, but if you have strict rule pacifism, which is one kind of pacifism, strict rule pacifism, that for Bonhoeffer is a principle. He was not a principled Christian. Principles are things that you hold on to and you live by, and you can think of yourself as faithful before you have interaction with real human life. If you are a principled person only, with ideals. But it's the life together where we are called to be faithful. And in our life together, you know of people being slaughtered. What are you to do? This is what leads him in the direction of throwing himself on the mercy of God and participating in the plan for a new government. That's kind of a longish answer to that question. Does that make sense? All right, so why don't we have some dialogue?
I have a question which may be more academic than is intended for this group, but I'd like to in any direction. You can't hear me, you can. That you want to take it. I believe you had said in your earlier remarks that slave trade is the source of racism. Did I catch that?
One of the agents mobilized, but yes.
Okay. Now, in contrast to that, there is ancient Greek writings about fantastical other people and the notion of autoxity, if you like your 10 other words, as when you read Herodotus or Thucydides or those people, and don't, by the way, that you get a sense of inherent racism in those comments. And I don't know if those were related to slavery or not, because I don't know of that particular time. And then also I've often speculated about the fact that we're the only species left in our genus may have had something to do with our innate desire to slaughter people who are not quite like us.
Yeah. It's actually not so deeply academic as on face value as it may seem. The question has to do with the origins of racism and how far back does it go. If I could. So take the very word that we understand as ethnic, coming from the Greek ethnos. This has to do with the language of other. And historically, people have done this time and again. Other people. Some even describe the practice of negative outgroup distortions as something like race, where we know us and we project some negative picture of the others. And people may see something like that happening as well between the Jew and the Gentile, the people of God and the others, as something along the lines of race. And maybe there are correlates in that way. And it would look more so like xenophobia than it would like racism. It's important to recognize the distinction of fear of others as opposed to racism. Racism is a construct, scientifically especially, of the Enlightenment in the modern period. And it's a Western world construct. Race, the development of race, is historically the classifying of all of human life according to categories or types of human beings. In the 18th century, the Swedish botanist Carl von Linnaeus wrote a thick book called Natural Systems. In this book, Natural Systems, he provides the world with the first taxonomy of human beings. Africanus with his character traits, Europeanus with his character traits. You gotta be careful saying that in public. Americanus, who at this time was red-skinned, you know, with the red Native Americans. Asiaticus, which he describes as yellow. And then Monstrosus, which is a waistband category for different types of human beings that they hadn't classified yet. There's 5 categories of the human. This taxonomy is the first in the practice of creating race as an operative, scientific, valid norm. Interesting how Europeanus is so wonderful. Blue-eyed, brawny, sanguine, governed by rules, clothes himself with close vestments and so forth. Well, the Africanus is phlegmatic, lazy, governed by caprice, and so all of these different kinds of things to cover these character traits of people in the invention of race. It's a different thing. In fact, the creation of race is the way in which it's an anthropology that goes along with this practice that is really in play at the time of building the Western world. I would describe it as a financially incentivized anthropology.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Pastor Sarah Schrischlick at East Lutheran Church. And as you're talking about Bonhoeffer, I couldn't help but think of the assassination that happened on Thursday. I don't know if you call it assassination, or assassination attempt that happened on Thursday. And Scalise, yeah. And the instinct I have to hold Bonhoeffer and the guy that attacked the Congresspeople as really different kinds of people acting out of really different instincts. And yet I think there's a similar fear of something happening in government that might connect them or drive them. And so I'm wondering if you could, this is a question, I'm sorry, I should have started with, this is a question.
I understand.
Because I love that you're doing that. What's the litmus test? What are the important questions to ask? Because I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this kind of violence in our government and in our world, and to be able to think, what are the questions Bonhoeffer was asking that we need to be asking to guide how we react, how we respond, and how we talk about these kinds of incidences? What are the questions?
Sure. Well, on one hand, with response to that question will come from an interaction with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. My interaction with Dietrich Bonhoeffer also includes Bonhoeffer's take on Black Christianity. So there's two. Mine is a kind of a nuanced response that's textured from specifically a Bonhoeffer perspective. That guy acted all alone. Who went after Scalise? He was a lone, vengeance-filled person. Bonhoeffer is not, by any stretch. He's coming from a community that understands themselves to be seeking what is the will of God for us now. This is the church for Bonhoeffer. Never in isolation. This is one of the problems with people who have understood themselves to be acting in a Bonhoefferian way, is they're just plain old Americans. Individual bootstrap folk who are motivated in their indignance to act, but they're not doing this from a perspective of the community seeking to fulfill the will of God. Not an assassination attempt, it's a replacement government from a community of people working together with others that are coming from the church. That's an important distinction. So if you've seen, for example, if you've seen Operation, the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, Bonhoeffer's not in that movie, but that's the assassination attempt at that moment, the end of the movie. You see that at least the bigger picture in that is Klaus von Stauffenberg had a full government in place. He had a full-on government there. There were Christians who were also in a part of that effort, but they were not lone wolves. Just to harp on that. There's a big. Did that answer that? Now the way that this is informed as well by a perspective of the Black church, Black Christianity, again has to do with the being together in community type of thing. But it's also paying close attention to the fact that they're identifying with Christ and Christ's suffering. If you've read or seen letters and papers from prison, they've included in this collection of letters that Bonhoeffer wrote back and forth to friends and family, a piece titled After 10 Years. It comes a lot from something that he writes in his posthumous book, Ethics. He's published in that. But in After 10 Years, he points out all of these different things that don't work about being moral. Conscience, duty, so forth. They don't work. And he highlights one. I talk about it in the last chapter of my book, called Seeing from the Perspective of Suffering. But this is important. To summarize, you don't know the value or the good of your community from the perspective of people who are esteemed and comfortable in it. You know whether or not your community is faithful by the perspective of people who are suffering within what you're calling a good community. We cannot think of our community from the perspective of the Aryan. We must see our community from the perspective of the Jew to know whether or not this is a faithful and good community. There, I interpret this is what he's saying. From that perspective, we need to do something. So, if that helps.
I'm Joe McKinney from Bethlehem Lutheran Church. This is an aspect that I'm really asking for your comments on, and that is Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the emissary of the Confessing Church to the Church of England, to Bishop Bell, in an attempt to help the United Kingdom's government understand that there were indeed resistance groups in Germany. And in fact, he was rejected by Winston Churchill, who was at that point pretty anti-German. I'm just asking for your comments.
That's exactly right. Bell could not convince Churchill and others to listen to Bonhoeffer because he was German, specifically because he was German. Had they listened and provided the support that they were asking, that Bonhoeffer was asking for, something could have been done differently. I had the distinct pleasure of having this exact conversation with one of the co-founders of the International Bonhoeffer Society. He was close friends with Bonhoeffer's best friend. He remains a good friend of mine. His name is Ferdinand Schlingensieber. There's a good German name for you. I was struggling without my chalkboard to write Stellvertreter. I think Schlingensieber, but I think I can do. He's got a biography that's one of the most trusted biographies on Bonhoeffer's life. By Ferdinand Schlingensieber. The two that people pay attention to are the one by Eberhard Bethge, Bonhoeffer's best friend and the one who introduced the world to him, sits off the desk, off the table like, I mean, it's a thick biography. And Bethge told Ferdinand, nobody's going to read that many pages on Bonhoeffer. Why don't you do an updated one? So in the 90s, Ferdinand wrote one. And it's shorter. It's very readable. He's a dear friend of mine, I would say. He's saying that when Bonhoeffer's talking to Bishop Bell found of course he was good friends with Dietrich, and he did a memorial service. And it was actually the announcement for the memorial service that Bishop Bell was doing that Bonhoeffer's parents found out that he had died. They didn't feel like a good German was one, well, to paraphrase, a good German is a dead German, not one that you can have conversation with. You're not going to move anybody with that as a perspective on Germans. How unfortunate. But good question.
Thank you so much for thought-provoking presentation. I'm Carmelo, and I serve Old Lutheran Church in Annandale. And I am curious about what you're witnessing now that are helpful practices that embody the type of theology that Luther learned from the Renaissance, the Hardy Renaissance, that are helpful. I know that sometimes the churches struggle with being prophetic or being helpful in this practice. So I'm curious, not only as an ethicist, but also someone involved in these struggles. What are you seeing that is helping and that would help inform the way that we go about the situations that we're seeing today that, I mean, with a big distance, but parallel to what Bonhoeffer had to deal with?
Yeah. Good question. Who's doing what, and what are the things that we see happening in society right now that look more like faithful Christianity? We can point out the problems. We can do that for a long time. But I should say also that pointing out those problems are also helpful. They're necessary. Diagnosis determines treatment. Without good diagnosis, we can't see, or we don't know. You don't want to give somebody Rolaids when they've got stomach cancer. But I can tell you that Egypt was a...
Well, I just forgot my preface to the question, as I heard you talking. The thing is that as a Lutheran, I'm always surprised by how Bonhoeffer is embraced, as if Bonhoeffer had been Lutheranism during Nazism. And we forget that he was the minority, as you say, and that the majority of Lutherans did not agree with what Bonhoeffer was saying, and probably pointed fingers at him, you know, like, what are you doing? And my concern is that today, we are dealing with many social struggles, and many people are dying, and there's injustice. And what I want to understand is, rather than us falling in a comfortable position, thinking that, you know, we come from this tradition, I want to understand if you have seen, as an ethicist, as somebody that follows this trend, today, what are practices that embody not just pointing to others what they're doing, but that are actually doing it now? I don't know if I made it more complicated, but that's what's in my mind.
Are you asking for maybe concrete things like this church is doing this with the homeless and...
Well, not only churches, but if you see how people are bringing the theology into practice in ways that are helpful.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Where is this happening at? In some ways, it's not something new that I'm talking about, as if this is now happening where it wasn't happening before. I would point to somebody like Harriet Tubman, who we talked about earlier. She was actively doing the kind of thing that we would say the church should embody. There was Sojourner Truth. There was, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the pastor of the church that Bonhoeffer attended, got into a significant public fight of words with other black pastors in Harlem that was instigated by a black woman who was a reporter, saying that the Great Depression is ravishing our community, and you pastors are comfortable with your cars and your houses. And the church initiated a food kitchen and so forth, and it was a wealthy black church. In other words, they recognized their faithfulness not in their creeds, as Powell said, but in their deeds. That Christian faithfulness is connected not to what we claim to believe, but how we engage real life in our midst. One of the things that is also important to think through is the fact that in Germany, and even here today, lots of Christians, whole lot of Christians, can see themselves as being faithful to God, faithful, loving to their family, and to their country, and on the wrong side of history, dead wrong. How does that happen? This is some of what the Barmen Declaration is trying to get at, but even in the Barmen Declaration, there's no mention of Jewish people. They completely omitted them, ignored them. Karl Barth recognized that later. He wished that he'd had Bonhoeffer's insight. The way in which, this is what I get at as an ethicist, we work from the context of idealized humanity and idealized community keeps us from being able to simply recognize the problem inside of the question that you're asking. How do I know what I'm supposed to, that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Are there any Christians that are actually doing what Christians are supposed to be doing?